I want to talk about my favorite contradiction in the whole Bible. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the Bible has numerous contradictions in it, and that's just not up for serious debate. But my favorite contradiction has to do with the question of who killed Goliath. Most people know one of the most famous stories in the whole Bible of David killing Goliath, but that story was probably swiped from an earlier tradition by the editors who were putting together the story of David's life. And that earlier tradition is probably preserved in one of the two references to Goliath that exist outside of the book of 1 Samuel. One is in 2 Samuel 21:19, and the other is in 1 Chronicles 20, verse 5. And these two verses tell the story of war with the Philistines, where somebody named Elhanan kills a giant. Now, in 2 Samuel 21:19, it says that Elhanan killed Goliath, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam, which is precisely how the Goliath of 1 Samuel 17 is described in verse 7. Now, when we go to 1 Chronicles 20, verse 5, it says that Elhanan killed Lachmi, the brother of Goliath. Now, if your version of 2 Samuel 21:19 says that Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath, that's just because the translators have just harmonized that passage with what's going on in 1 Chronicles 20. Because 2 Samuel 21:19 does not have the word brother. So here's the relevant Hebrew from the two different passages. 2 Samuel 21:19 is on top. 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5 is on the bottom. And this is not the entire verse. This is just the relevant part, because I'm going to put red circles around the words that differ. Everything else is pretty much the same. But on the top, it says Bethlehemite, et, and then this is the Hebrew direct object marker. So this is a syntactical particle that identifies the direct object of a verbal action. And here the verb, which I am not showing here, is smite or kill Goliath. And then on the bottom, we have 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5, where we have that verb smite or kill, but then we have the direct object marker et, indicating that the direct object of the verbal action is Lachmi, the brother of Goliath. And I've circled these four words because they look quite similar. You can kind of see how a scribe or an editor might kind of confuse some of these words. And so the folks who think that there's no contradiction here would argue that the editor of 2 Samuel, or whoever was responsible for writing down 2 Samuel, misunderstood what the source of 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5 had, namely that Elhanan killed Lachmi, the brother of Goliath. And there are several considerations that falsify that assumption. The actual distortion is in 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5, and here's why. The first consideration is a text critical principle that is known as Leio Deficilior. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's an observation that when there are changes text critically, they usually go from a more difficult or uncomfortable reading to a less difficult or a more comfortable reading. Because when people alter things intentionally, it's usually to fix problems. And so more likely, the direction of change would go from the very problematic reading, which has Elhanan killing Goliath, even though we all know David killed Goliath, to Elhanan killing the brother of Goliath. That's a more comfortable reading. But that's not remotely the only consideration. We also have the problem of the direction of change going from et to achi, or from the direct object marker to brother of. And the reason is that the tav and the chet, while they look very similar in the red circle on the left, only look similar in the Aramaic square script, which was a script that was adopted by the Judahites, who were responsible for transmitting the biblical text, after the exile. And 2 Samuel was edited just before the exile, and maybe a little bit after the exile, but 1 Chronicles was entirely edited after the exile. So you would not confuse the direct object marker with the word for brother until after the exile. And since 2 Samuel is working with sources that are pre-exilic, and 2 Samuel probably took its main shape prior to the exile, it is more likely that the confusion was on the part of the editors of the books of Chronicles. Another consideration is the notion that Elchanan killed some Philistine dude named Lachmi. That is not a Philistine word. It's a Semitic word, and it's a Semitic word that would mean my bread. And that's just not a naming convention that is known from this time or this place. However, as a corruption of Bethlehemite, Beit Halachmi, it makes sense as a corruption. The editors of 1 Chronicles 20 said, let's change it and let's leave Lachmi as a name of the brother of Goliath. That doesn't make any sense as the name of the Philistine brother of Goliath. So these are just the three, I think, strongest considerations that point very strongly in the direction of 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5 being the alteration of the earlier tradition, which is more accurately preserved in 2 Samuel 21:19, which attributes the killing of Goliath to a Bethlehemite named Elchanan. And so the editors of the story of David probably knew about that other story and thought, why don't we say David is the one who killed Goliath? And then crafted this story that we find in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And other people will say, well, 2 Samuel 21:19, that's a different time period, that's a different place, that's a different set of events. Yes, that's what happens when people swipe accomplishments from other characters. Those accomplishments come from other times and other places and other figures. That's perfectly natural. That observation doesn't actually complicate the scholarly consensus, which is that the earlier tradition is almost certainly that there was some dude named Elchanan who was a Bethlehemite who killed a giant named Goliath, and then later on the editors of the David tradition swiped that story, reattributed it to David, and that became the far more famous story of the killing of Goliath. So who killed Goliath? Well, we don't really have any indication that there was ever a historical battle where a giant named Goliath was killed by a Bethlehemite, but within the Bible, the earliest tradition attributes the killing of Goliath to a Bethlehemite named Elchanan, and then later editors of the David tradition seem to have swiped that accomplishment and attributed it to King David, and that became the far more famous story. And that is my favorite contradiction in the whole Bible. And the fit for this video has been the death of Superman.